We're live.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined today. My name is Amy Batson, and I'm the Executive Director of WomenLift Health. Thank you so much for joining us for our second virtual speaker series event, Gender and Power in COVID-19. Today, we'll hear from three fantastic speakers on what gender means for leadership, especially in this moment of COVID-19. This is part of a series where we're analyzing the gender and power dynamics at play in health emergencies with leaders from across the health, development, and political sectors. So today's topic, snapshots of leadership from female decision makers across the world. As of today, coronavirus is reported to have infected more than 3.1 million people worldwide, and has placed roughly a third of the world's population under a lockdown or a shelter-in-place order. Some countries have made significant progress to flatten the curve and save lives, while others have struggled. As the world turns its attention to analyzing what has worked, what is working, an interesting finding has emerged. Many of the countries that are doing best are led by women. The media, as I'm sure many of you have seen, including The Guardian, Forbes, New York Times, Washington Post, and many other channels, have taken note. The sample size is small. Women lead less than 7% of countries around the world and make up only 24% of lawmakers. So few have the governing power to decide and enforce preparedness policies. This maps to global health, where while 70% of the workforce is made up of women, less than a third of senior leadership positions are held by women, obviously impacting global health's priorities and resource allocations. We know that sex and gender do not inherently determine whether someone will be an effective leader or not. Many countries led by men are taking the right steps to stop the spread of the virus. And some countries led by women actually do not have effective responses. Yet the news coming out of many countries led by women is striking enough that it is worth shining a light on their achievements, discussing what gender might mean for effective leadership, and calling for more action to ensure women can reach the top decision-making tables in times of crises and in calm. Before introducing our speakers, I want to go over just a few housekeeping items. First, please do send us any questions throughout the event through the chat line function. We'll be collecting them, and then I will be posing your questions to the speakers during the Q&A session at the end. We are recording this session and we'll make it available on our website and social channels. And finally, if you don't already, please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @WomenLiftHealth, and feel free to tag us with additional questions and comments about today's event. So without further ado, I am truly honored to welcome our esteemed speakers today. First, we are delighted to have Her Excellency, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia. President Sirleaf was the first elected female head of state on the African continent. She led her country through another health crisis, the 2014 Ebola outbreak, and did so in the wake of Liberia's second civil war. And she won the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of her efforts to bring women into the peacekeeping process. Welcome, President Sirleaf, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm also delighted to welcome the Right Honorable Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, who is the first elected female Prime Minister in New Zealand, has held numerous cabinet positions, including as Minister of Health and Minister of Housing, and was the first female head of the UN Development Program, UNDP, where under her leadership, the organization achieved gender parity. I'm also delighted that she's agreed to join the WomenLift Health Board to continue to share her insights. Helen, thank you so very much for joining us. And last, I'd like to introduce Dr. Zoe Marks, who is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where her research focuses on the intersections of conflict and political violence, race, gender, and inequality. She's written a number of very interesting articles on gender, including having penned an op-ed recently in the Washington Post on women's political leadership under COVID-19. Dr. Marks, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So speaking for myself and for all the audience, we are so honored to be with the three of you today. So I'd like to start with the first round of questions, and if I may, beginning with you, President Sirleaf. You led Liberia through the 2014 Ebola outbreak and have been vocal about the lessons that the world can learn from that experience. As someone who has led a country through a devastating epidemic and out the other side, what are some of the qualities that are most important for leadership in a crisis such as we're facing? And does gender play a role here?
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much. I think one has to, first of all, be guided by values instilled as a child, reshaped perhaps by experience, and then demonstrate the responsibility of leadership by taking responsibility, by being able to be firm in decisions, building a team that will enable you to be able to listen to the voices of others and trying to make a decision, ensuring that you lead by example so that you build the confidence of others, being honest in communicating with the public, particularly when you're dealing with matters that affect their lives and livelihoods. If you will be able to get the compliance to some of the decisions and the guidelines that have been issued, I think one has to, as a leader, go beyond fears when you're dealing with something like the epidemic we now have, that we had in the case of Ebola. So that, again, like I said, by example, by going beyond your own fears, you'd be able to redress and address the fears of others. Bold decisions. There comes a time when you're all alone and you have to face a decision. We faced it in the case when I had to make a decision about cremation in a society for which that was totally taboo. A large percentage of our population are Muslims. But if we had not done that, we would have had many more lives that would have been lost. And there are times when one have to admit mistakes and missteps and just take the action to be able to redress it, to change course. And we faced one such when we started Ebola with military action to stop the movement of people, and found that it resulted in rebellion on the part of the population, lack of confidence, in some case, even the death of someone, and quickly told the public, we're wrong. And we knew then we had to go to our community leaders. And that's why it's so important as a leader to involve people who are leaders in the communities, who are workers in the communities, who know the value, who know the tradition and the culture of the population. and can ensure that your decision takes due account of those particular things, the way people live, the way they do. So, all in all, a leadership takes charge, take responsibility, take bold action, make hard decisions, are honest in communicating to the public, and at the end of the day, wherever, let them know what things need to be done and stand firm in your own respect for the rules and regulations that you espouse. I think those are how I was guided in my leadership, and how that helped me to lead the team that was able to respond effectively to stop the Ebola despite the predictions, but yet we lost some 4,800 people that perhaps could have been avoided if we were better prepared.
Thank you for those insights. Helen, building on what President Sirleaf has just outlined, and the world has been acclaiming Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's response, and you've publicly praised her approach to how she's responded and contained COVID-19 in New Zealand. Can you build a little on that and say, what has the Prime Minister done right?
Well, first, as President Ellen said, thanks for having us on to share some insights at this time, which has been so challenging for leaders in so many countries. And if there's a textbook to be written about how to respond, I think we'll be writing it around these successful responses where women leaders clearly have done far better than the average in handling it. And pretty much, I think, for the reasons that President Ellen has set out, I think the women leaders who are being judged to be very successful here are very people-centered. And they don't want on their watch people dying or becoming extremely seriously ill with possible legacy effects without them having been seen to do the most they can to stop that. And living in New Zealand, I think people across the political spectrum, whatever they may think of Jacinda Ardern or her government in general, they know the government's got their back. And that is an incredible thing for building trust. I think that for Jacinda Ardern, there's been three key characteristics. One, of course, she's clever. You don't get, as a woman, to break through all the barriers that so many of us have had to break through to get to these positions without, in many ways, having to prove that you can do the job twice as well. There's that. But second, I think a critical factor has been empathy. That people feel you're on their side. These are tough decisions. It's a tough decision to close down the economy, to tell people in one of the world's oldest democracies like New Zealand, one of a handful of countries that was able to be a democracy throughout the 20th century, that you are not going to have your liberty in many respects for weeks, and we don't know for how long. These are tough decisions, but you can make them if you have the community on your side. And to do that, you also have to communicate effectively. And we have seen for virtually every day in the past 6 weeks in New Zealand, our Prime Minister step up in the podium, in the parliamentary theaterette, and she's addressed New Zealanders and she says, this is what we're doing and this is why. And then she takes a cacophony of media questions, all shouting to get attention. She doesn't lose her cool. She just keeps with her message and engaging people. And the only way you can succeed in a public health crisis like this is having the team of your whole country on side, as President Ellen said. When the responses in West Africa, as I observed as head of UNDP at the time, really got traction, was not just when the world came to help, as eventually it did. And that was in no small part due to President Ellen getting on the phone to President Obama and saying, I need help. And that's not an easy thing to say as a leader either, because you've got to admit you need help. but help came. But I think the critical factor I observed was that communities were engaged, communities were empowered. President Ellen, I saw in your country the way the young people responded when the call went out, help us, the way they went door to door to see if there were sick people in the neighborhood. So the community mobilization is critical, and the leader who can reach out and inspire that reaction from people will be the leader who eventually leads people through with the least damage, because these crises come on us like a tidal wave. People have died. Every death is a tragedy, but the leaders who can get a successful response to have traction are going to be the ones that we remember.
Thank you. Well, I think as you're saying, as the textbook, we're seeing it being written and listening to both of you drawing on your own experiences as leaders, and as you reflect on what some of the current leaders, particularly women leaders, are doing. Zoe, so we are hearing that so many of the countries that are doing best with the COVID responses, we've heard New Zealand, in addition, Taiwan, Germany, all led by women. Can you reflect a little on what are the qualities evident in their leadership that are helping them to succeed? And are these unique to this global health emergency kind of response, or are these the type of attributes that we've seen in women's leadership at other times?
Sure. Thanks so much, Amy. And let me also just say it's an honor to be here with President Ellen and with Helen. You've both been inspirations to me and to my students, and to the research that we do to kind of shore up the evidence base. So much of what I will say will actually echo what you've said from your own lived experience. I think the first thing to keep in mind, which is really unique about this current coronavirus pandemic, is that unlike other sort of policy situations where we've been able to kind of think about women's leadership and men's leadership in terms of hypotheticals and these small n, as you said, there's only some 7% of countries globally have a female head of state. The coronavirus pandemic is hitting all countries with the same problem. And so countries have very different sets of resources and very different contexts in which the virus will spread and with which to mobilize a public health response. But it is really quite unique that all countries would simultaneously face basically the same nature of threat simultaneously. And so that's giving us a relatively unprecedented way to look at how women perform in their positions of power compared to men. And as you rightly stress, this is not a case of sort of biological determinism or gender essentialism. Women are not inherently good at certain things like a public health pandemic response, and men are not inherently weak at it. But we have seen a couple of things that have really been consistent across all women-led countries and across many of the countries where male leaders are succeeding. And the first is that the policy itself has to be good, right? And so good public health policy comes not from having necessarily the right person in office with all of the kind of prior knowledge of how to deal with an unanticipated threat, but rather, as President Ellen said, from mobilizing a team. And so one thing we know from research on gender differences in leadership patterns is women tend to be more participative and democratic in their leadership style. And this is true not just for heads of state, regardless of your regime type, but also in mid-level management and heads of corporations and NGOs, perhaps in the home and in households. And that means that they are able to engage bottom-up decision-making, get input from their subordinates, and then, as President Ellen rightly said, make a difficult decision. So make a call that the people they work with in their team see as fair and as wise. And the second thing that we have really strong evidence women tend to do better than men is they tend to have what's called transformative or transformational leadership. And this refers just to an innate ability to motivate people and to signal that there's a common cause. And one of the things that I have pointed out in some of my writing is that the pandemic sets up a followership crisis as much as a potential leadership crisis. We really need people to cooperate and collaborate and all take varying degrees of sacrifices for the common good. And it looks as though women leaders have, through messaging and steady communication, been able to motivate their followers in a way that actually benefits the whole collective. And of course, this extends beyond their national borders. And so one of the things that we've also seen women leading the charge on is in some of the kind of early mobilization of funds and resources for countries that have fewer supplies and less access to kind of recovery and rebuilding funds. So both Norway and Switzerland, which are women-led, started early response fundraising for countries like Liberia that don't have access to as much wealth and as much kind of political resource. And so we've seen that there's also international solidarity that women leaders are championing. And I think that's relatively consistent with some of the other gender trends that we're seeing in leadership. The last thing I just wanted to mention is, in terms of thinking about what specifically in the context of a global pandemic women are doing well, where you might see the kind of dovetailing of both the policy response and women's leadership attributes, where we know women are particularly strong. And that's on thinking about social support early. So social support measures have been really essential for getting people to stay home from work. It's been essential for having people think about what their role is in a quarantine, for shoring up the economic burden on families, for preventing hunger and other forms of loss. We've also seen that some of the women leaders have really led the charge on preparedness, and they've spoken early and often about taking a prevention approach rather than a kind of belated attempt to level an overly steep curve. And I think that's where you can think about, maybe there are gender dynamics that are particularly well suited for this particular kind of policy challenge.
So amazing to hear about the sort of balancing between getting all of the input in a participatory way to then make a fair and smart and tough decision. The kind of importance of engaging the community and building trust so that your population is willing to follow and is willing to comply with what is being proposed. And some of the perhaps gendered traits that can be contributing to that. But all of this is happening in a context, like in an environment, and where there's certain perspectives and environmental pressures of men, women, how it's perceived. And so maybe beginning with you, Helen, we know that ultimately supporting women's leadership has to be embraced by those who are in power today. And those who are in power today is mostly men. At WomenLift Health, we're very sensitive to recognizing our male allies and avoiding sexist stereotypes. And we face a challenge when we want to call out positive aspects of women's leadership. It's sometimes interpreted in this sort of narrowly defined kind of environmental way, or as compared to male counterparts. And so how can we be praising and highlighting women's leadership without pitting men and women against each other?
Well, my understanding is that if you look at women's leadership in, say, the corporate sphere, the skills and attributes that often characterize that leadership are ones that do get results. So, generally we want leaders to be effective. So let's look at what those attributes are, which make for effective leadership. And it is exactly as President Ellen and Zoe have been stressing, the willingness to listen, not having such a big ego that you can't actually change your mind on the basis of the best advice system that you've got. Knowing that you need everybody on board, and that in the end, the decisions that are taken in a top-down way, without thought being given to how people will react, and I can say, looking at a number of the male leader examples on display at the moment, not even really caring how people are going to react, or making provision for their sheer survival in the middle of this existential crisis. These are very important characteristics. So I think that when this textbook is written and we start to elaborate on what worked and what didn't, we will be looking at these leadership attributes, which on average, women showed more in the midst of the crisis than a number of men did. And like you, Amy, I don't want to dismiss the fine efforts of a number of the male leaders. I think the president of South Korea, for example, has been a standout example in leading through a very difficult early outbreak there. But I'm certainly proud, very proud of what the women leaders have demonstrated. And I guess a little bit of the commentary has almost been, oh, gee, those women did well. No, those women did exactly what we would expect women leaders to do. They did exactly what we would expect every leader to do. Yeah. They're providing role models. I think that's the kind of message that I would want to get across. If you want to be an effective leader, use this rather tragic time as a case study of what needs to be done to take a whole nation through a crisis.
President Sirleaf, as a leader, you wrote your own script for leading through a crisis. When I would imagine there were such kind of expectations and pressures on you for defining leadership by what is the more standard, traditional, expected kind of masculine script. What did you feel that? Were there pressures that you were facing and that you were having to chart your own way as a woman leader?
I think women earn leadership on the basis of equal competencies. Being able to apply then the decisions, the actions, to be able to address a crisis is where women leaders stand out. There are no apologies on taking the decision. There are no fears about the public responses and the criticism. Women tend to make the decision on the basis of what's best for solving the problem. Don't worry about the next elections and whether, how the opposition's going to be able to attack me and all of that. Women tend to go beyond that because they're concerned about lives. They're concerned about people. They're concerned about humanity. Maybe it comes from just being a woman, but that does not in any way stop short of being able to apply the same kind of firmness, of decision-making, of boldness, of competence that is required in those cases. And so if this means, that there's going to be someone saying, there's some cases where one will say, oh, well, she's acting like a man in taking that particular action. Yeah, so what? Acting as a leader, and I take the decision on the basis of the circumstances and being able to motivate people that I can lead to be able to join me in a certain action and not to worry about what everyone thinks about it, as long as it's the right thing to do based upon the information that one has. Women tend to do it without fear. And I think that makes a big difference in why I think in a matter of crisis, women tend to shine through because of this extra courage and boldness to be able to do what needs to be done without fear.
Helen, I'd love you to answer the same from your personal perspective of, how did you define your own leadership script, including the issues that you chose to focus on?
Well, let me say that in New Zealand, there were no appropriate role models for me coming up as a young woman leader in politics, and actually very few globally. Some I knew of, like former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was from a similar political tradition and also from a small Western democracy, but no New Zealanders had ever heard of her. So when I landed on the scene as leader of the opposition, which is actually the toughest job in politics, in my opinion. I had to carve a path, and then you ran into a lot of stereotypes, because to be an effective leader of the opposition, obviously you have to depose the prime minister, you have to bring the government down, and that requires obviously creating a case that you and what you represent can do better than they can, and of course it involves quite a lot of critiquing. Now, what I found was that women on the attack are perceived rather differently from men on the attack. Women are seen as tough and almost, not feminine as they go about this work. And then I also found, and this is still true to some extent, that women attracted an entirely different kind of commentary from what men leaders had attracted. There was an excessive interest in how you looked and how you dressed and how you spoke, and all of this was noise, which you had to break through. What I eventually worked out, and I was 6 years as leader of the opposition, I lost the first election I contested, was the key thing was authenticity. You had to be yourself. You couldn't pretend to be anyone else. You had to follow your own instincts. Being very open and very transparent was absolutely critical. And you can never communicate too much. You must communicate, say what you're thinking, why you're thinking it, be able to tell stories and stories about people, human stories, people you've met. What are their experiences? Because that makes you real. Then people see, yeah, she understands that. She knows, what it's like for people, battling with these kinds of issues. So those were the things I learned along the way. And coming from a small, intimate democracy, you just have to put yourself out there and be available. And I was very available to media. I'm actually amazed often how little many leaders do put themselves on show for their publics. In New Zealand, there's parliamentary questions for the Prime Minister 3 days a week. And there's an expectation that come Monday morning before the Cabinet, you will do probably 7 live media interviews. And every time you walk from your office through the parliamentary chamber, you will be stopped by a gaggle of journalists who ask questions. So you just have to run with that, not hide from it, and always be communicating. So those were some of the things that I learned.
So Francesca, we've heard from 2 very powerful, extremely effective women leaders who defined their own leadership styles to lead their countries. And calling on, obviously there's equal competence, but then beyond that, it's the focus ultimately on doing what is right, doing what is going to save lives, is important to the people, rather than just being reelected. The importance of having your own authentic voice and being very open, very transparent, and communicative with all of the environment, so you're engaging your everyone around you. In your recent op-ed, you identified some other ways that the environment and some of these pressures may interact with some of how a woman is leading, how she may be perceived, as Helen was highlighting. And you also included a concept of the glass cliff. And can you expand a little bit more on how some of these other kind of environmental factors come to play, and drawing on the lived experiences of President Sirleaf and Helen?
I think it's important to keep in mind that we're in the rarefied air of women who've made it. And so there's a bit of a selection bias in our conversation today, that there are also many qualified women who could not break through the ceilings that President Ellen and Right Honorable Helen broke through. And so that is, it's worth kind of pausing to think about, what does gender do for us, and how does it work against women in particular as they pursue power? And there's a lot of disagreement in the research about whether or not there are in fact double standards. There's been extensive survey research in America, which is where I live, and it finds that women and men think that women and men can make equally good leaders, but there are gender stereotypes that put women in particular in a double bind. And so whether or not we have double standards, the double bind is the reality that women leaders have to conform to feminine gender expectations. So they have to signal that they are communal, that they do not take too much space, that they are not dominant, that they're not bossy, that they're not greedy, that their ambition is only to serve other people. These are some of the sort of feminine expectations that are imposed on women who seek positions of power and authority, that their power and authority should not be for themselves. But those same women seeking positions of power who are trying to kind of conform to feminine expectations also need to meet and overcome masculine expectations of what power looks like. So women are disadvantaged in people's perceptions of their decisiveness and their boldness. People tend to think, both women and men hold these biases, they tend to think that men are more confident, and they tend not to penalize men for talking too much. And so some of the dynamics that bear out in the research can help us sort of understand that there is this double bind that women are facing. And that kind of relates to what I was saying about this particular crisis, this particular pandemic policy challenge, may be particularly well suited for women leaders because it allows them to kind of amplify some of those feminized leadership strengths. And I use this in quotes because the way that stereotypes work is not that they are innate to people's biology. It's not that we're born with it chromosomally, at least as far as we know, but rather that the expectations imposed on us throughout our lives shape what we perceive others want from us. And so particularly in elected politics, but even in non-elective systems, women learn to perform and present their power in ways that they will not be punished for. So as we think about what are the external pressures that women leaders are facing above and beyond the pandemic, women tend to be punished personally for bad economic outcomes. They tend to be penalized personally for failed policy choices. It is more common to attribute male leaders to having bad luck. And so again, there's not a ton of evidence because we have so few female heads of state, and two of whom we're very fortunate to have with us today. But for women who kind of either know this internally or know this because of the research, it helps to explain why some of the female leaders may have really leaned into preparedness, prevention, and to that social safety net that I talked about, because that's one of the ways that they can try to usher forward not only the survival and well-being and recovery of their people, as President Ellen so poignantly stated, but also a way to mitigate against some of the penalties that women face as a result of the double bind.
President Sirleaf for Helen, I don't know if you have any sort of reactions to hearing this from the perspective of what the research shows, but does, is that ringing true for your own personal experiences?
Women live in a dominated male society. They dominate. And it's just when women are able to go through the rough and tumble of the stereotyping, of all that gets thrown, particularly if you're a political leader, that you gain the amount of respect to be able to lead in a manner that gains the confidence of your people and the respect of the world. But there's always that watching, listening to what you do, how you say it, wanting to see if your actions are going to bring the results. And if you're very bold, yes, you're aggressive, and men's boldness are assertive. You're aggressive, and too aggressive as a woman. I think, women are able to go through that, but it does deter so many women from seeking the high leadership that they have all the qualities to be, because they don't want to go through that. They don't want to go through the fact that when the media makes a report, I mean, chances are they'll be able to say all the, to give the women such a difficult time in characterizing them and judging them as compared from men under the same circumstances and the same kind of conditions. Because, you know, that's where we are today. And that's why it's so important that women leaders stand out, you know, when they've reached a place where they're bold enough to do so. And to be able to reach back to other women where we try to grow, uh, develop the number, encourage the number of women to become leaders. Because if you're in my position, the only one elected woman in an African continent, you know, that's sitting in a meeting with nothing but men, you know, and I mean, you're under the microscope, you know. And so you have to be strong, not to be intimidated by this whole crowd of men, you know, and gathering in their own men's circles and doing their own lobbying and whatnot. It can be lonely out there, you know, when you find yourself at that top leadership and you're there alone. Um, but it also is something that's so satisfying that we can begin to build all the role models, and there's so many of them now that can inspire all the younger women to move ahead on their leadership journey and to be able to claim leadership and take what it calls for to be a leader and to stand firm, you know, and move forward. So
I'd certainly like to say a word on the double standard, which I am firmly of the view exists. A couple of years ago, I was asked to, as one of many examples, to go up to Solomon Islands to work with a large group of women who had come forward to say, we want to see more women elected in Solomon Islands, because the most that had ever been in the parliament was 3 out of around 40 or so. And so women came from all over this diverse island nation to the workshop, and I was one of those who was working alongside the women on the skills and what to expect and so on. And some research was done prior to this workshop, and it asked voters in the Solomon Islands whether they would be prepared to vote for a woman for Parliament. And over 70% said, oh, yes, we'd be prepared to vote for one. Guess what? The next election still only produced around 3 women out of the 40. Nothing changed at all. So, you know, in the abstract, oh, yes, I would vote for one. But then somehow it just never seems to be the right woman, because the stereotype of who will be a member of Parliament is not that of the woman who's presenting herself in your constituency. So some of these barriers can be very, very hard to break through. Another thing I think many women experience in their lives, and which is also experienced at the top political level, is women actually not being heard when they contribute. You can be sitting at the top table with a group of men. This has happened to me at the UN. I can think of leaders' meetings I've participated in as a Prime Minister over 9 years, and you would make a contribution in this round table setting, as it were, and no one would react. 2 or 3 speakers later, a male leader or participant would make pretty much the same point, and then they'd all chirp in saying, didn't Bruce make a good point? You think, hang on, I said this 10 minutes ago. I mean, this is such a common experience for women, just not to be heard. And again, I think it's just a kind of tendency not to take you that seriously. And I think often younger women are looking at this and all these issues around women's leadership and thinking, do I really want to put myself through this? Our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is a phenomenon. Elected at 37, quite unexpectedly became Prime Minister, lifting her party off the political floor, as it were. And I have watched the relentless personal criticism and attacks
Mhm.
on her because she's young, because she's female, because she's a young mother now with a small child. It is really pretty tough. Nonetheless, here at home in New Zealand, the young women find her inspiring, and I hope that what they will take from what she is achieving is that regardless of how tough it is so important that women stare this down and get in and have a go and make a difference for people. But I am in no doubt about the double standard by which women are judged.
Well, so building on that a little, I think we're, WomenLift Health, we're very committed to action. Like, what can we do to ensure that more women rise to these leadership positions, don't opt out, don't choose to opt out because of all of the double standards and the rough and tumble that they'll be put through. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how do we translate what we're learning and these extraordinary sort of models of women leaders today in this COVID response to think about how do we support more women to be reaching kind of top positions. So President Sirleaf, Africa is home to the largest population of youth. So what can women leaders like yourself and like the elders, the group of very senior African leaders that I know you're a part of, do to help ensure that young African women are able to lead and to have the voice in this moment and in the future?
One of the things we have to do is to start at the roots, education. We've got to be able to help the girl child to get an education. So many of them, given the poverty situation, given the rural setting of our nation, that the lack of facilities, that unless we can improve the level of entry into education for girls, and I think in my administration, we did not gain full parity, but were able to bring women up to the place where women were almost there. And I think that we're going to see them full parity with men in terms of entrance into school. Retention, how do we do to encourage young women, poor young women who have no means and have to rely on assistance in their families, that they don't drop out of schools too early for pregnancy, because pregnancy, poverty, and all of that. So you've got to have a pool of women in poor countries. You start there. I think also then as women move up the leadership uh, um, journey, we need to be able to show where women leaders have indeed excelled. Where are the role models? They're growing, a growing number of them now. They haven't been there all along. There have been only exceptions here, there, and yonder that they could find in Europe or in Asia, or some places like that. Now in Africa, for example, we're beginning to have them, not only at the presidential level, but we have so many of them in business, so many of them working in different international organizations that are taking leadership. They are part of the role model system that we can point to now as an inspiration to younger women, helping these younger women to get past their own fears of a society that's male dominated and to be able to stand out. I know I'm involved in a Center for the Promotion of Women, Center for Women and Development, and its whole objective is to be able to take young women on their leadership journey and be able to pair them with mentors of women leaders who've already excelled, so that these mentors can work with them in partnerships and create the networks among them for information sharing, for advices. So I mean, they all have a platform. When we launched on International Women's Day, and we had 15 African women well advanced on their journey, but then matched by another 9 who really had excelled, people like Ngozi, you know, uh, coming in and Antoinette, some of the stars for us in Africa, meeting with them, exchanging with them, and on a platform, they can reach out to them. The pool of women leaders are beginning to grow. And I think that's what we all can help with. You know, it doesn't also have to be just in Africa. We need to have it across borders, across international borders, where women like Helen will be able to join being a mentor to some young African women that's on a journey and needs to benefit from her experience and her advice and her encouragement. You know, we need to expose them a little bit more, those who are trying, so they get an opportunity to go international and participate in a place where their perspectives can widen, you know, and their experience can be broadened and deepened. Again, that helps them to grow that kind of courage to go the next stage, knowing that they're gonna face trials, they're going to face obstacles because obstacles are there. But once they get past the fear of those obstacles and they can move forward and they can get the kind of support that they need from all women leaders, I think we'll see that in the next, decade or so, I hope we'll see the numbers so increase that we'll see another, I keep saying, you know, right now we have a big void in Africa. We don't have an African woman president anymore. We need one. We need 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll have to keep working at it.
So Helen, drawing on your experience at these highest levels of leadership, what is one tangible way to support women's leadership as the world continues to grapple with the effects of COVID-19?
Well, building on what President Ellen said, I think it is a question of growing the base of women who are able to step up from what they're doing, having gained the education, the experience in a particular walk of life, and have the confidence to say, I can bring what I've learned to decision making. Now let's have a big shout out for African women here. There are incredible, remarkable African women at every level of society, through media, NGO, the professions, local government, women making their way up through the police force, whatever. We meet them, they're fantastic. And to support women to then move from that to take that experience into political leadership, I think is the trick. They will see all the downside of it, and we've talked a bit about that, the double standards, the attacks and so on. But I think the message is, you've been able to show your competency in this other walk of life that you're in. You are needed now for your country, for your local government, for your region. Please come forward. So it is nurturing, mentoring, encouraging. All of this matters a great deal. And then as we also grow the number of women who are doing it, that again incentivizes. In New Zealand, as many will know, we now have our 3rd woman Prime Minister. It helps enormously that young people know that on average half the time the PM is going to be a woman. For more than half the last 20 to 23 years, women have been at the top. For me as leader of the opposition, it was enormously helpful that the governing party had a party room coup d'etat, pushed out a longer serving male leader and brought in a woman, because then it showed that women could fill these roles. It happened to be women versus women at the next election, but that kind of normalized women's leadership as well. So the more role models, the better. The more women we can encourage to come out from what they are doing well and taking those skills into the decision-making sphere, the better.
Excellent. Thank you. And it certainly is near and dear to our heart at WomenLift Health, where we're also all about a leadership journey for women across the world and in the global health space and mentoring. And so we'd be delighted to be joining forces with your organization, President Sirleaf, Women in Development. And again, Helen is on our board and will be giving and sharing her insights and guiding us as we go forward. Zoe, in your recent op-ed, you asked if voters are going to finally, quote, take heed, unquote. What do we need to do to make sure that we're using this moment for something really positive about moving forward on women's leadership?
I think there are two things that I hoped people would take away from that piece. And the first was just simply giving credit where it's due. I found it incredibly frustrating in the first 2 months or 3 months of the global crisis to watch the explanations come out more and more towards, well, it's the nature of these Scandinavian social democracies, it's the nature of these authoritarian or, you know, semi-democratic and strong party system Asian democracies. And it took a full month later before people realized, wow, actually more than half of the women-led countries in the world are at the top, literally getting the headlines. You know, Australia should be more like New Zealand. America was supposed to be like pretty much every country that is led by a woman. And you can look at these articles and you can see how long it took them to come up. And I think part of that goes back to what I was saying before about women being personally blamed when things go wrong, but rarely given the credit when things go right. And it sounds like a sort of, you know, maybe ragey feminist thing to say, but there's research that tells us it's true. And so my first and most kind of strident hope is that women who are leading through this crisis will be given credit. Not that their teams won't be given credit, but their leadership will be given credit for amplifying the talents of their teams. The second thing that I would like to see come out of this moment, and I think it will be a long moment of recovery, is I would like to see men and women alike, not all women have been doing well, I would like to see men and women alike adopt some of the leadership skills of the most talented female heads of state. And I think for me, what is striking is that men actually tend to get even better accolades and better outcomes when they use so-called feminine leadership tactics. So when men are participative and democratic, when they bring in their subordinates, when they appoint more women or at least equal men and women in their cabinets, and when they lead with a sort of transformational leadership of motivation and kind of collaborative singleness of spirit, they do even better than women do, right? So again, going back to the sort of double standards and double binds, it serves men to move away from toxic masculine leadership expectations. So to move away from egoism and aggression and conflict. And some of these things that do have a bit of a masculine valence, and sometimes I think male leaders lean into leadership styles that don't serve them, and they certainly don't serve us living in those countries. And so those are my two hopes, is that we'll give credit where it's due, and that men and women alike will learn from the female leaders who are doing so well and adopt those skills. And I just wanted to make a few more sub-points, which is that women do not have to be perfect to be overperforming. So a small error or adjustment, as President Ellen said, where you have to say, you know what, actually, this isn't working the way we had hoped. We think we have something better. That does not mean that a woman leader has failed. The dynamics that we've been talking about today are not only true at the top. So I know one of the things that I find so inspiring about WomenLift Health's work is that you are trying to get women in leadership at every level of the health system. And that is so important now because women on the front lines, so 70% of frontline healthcare workers, are essential for getting good information and good kind of clear-eyed, compassionate knowledge up the chain. And so I'd like to see this translate not only to how we think about presidents and heads of state, but also to how we think about every level at which we have power hierarchies operating in our society. And then finally, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned with regards to Africa being the youngest continent, because a lot of my work is on Africa, but one of the interesting points of intersection that I've noticed is that young people are doing a lot and will continue to do more to kind of set us on this path towards recovery. Some of those young people, some of the youngest heads of state, are these women leaders that we're talking about. And so we've seen some commentary around the millennial Finnish leader, and she's, you know, always described as this like glamorous millennial woman. And we tend to miss the point around the actual skills that young people are bringing to the table, the skills of synthesis, multilateralism, innovation, and applying, old lessons learned to kind of new technologies and new opportunities for building collaborative solutions at the community level. And so that focuses us to always keep in mind when we talk about gender, we're talking about it in an intersectional perspective. We have to think about how is race, class, age, and other attributes playing out, and who has access to power and who's able to be part of the solutions and part of the policy setting agenda.
Thank you, Zoe. So amazing insights from our speakers, from their very, very lived experience, from their continued engagement with world leaders, and from their research, helping us understand why gender really does play a role in political leadership, how we can talk about some of these issues without falling into gender stereotyping, and some of the special challenges that women leaders truly do face in their own journey toward becoming a leader. I think each of our speakers has highlighted some of these key qualities it takes to be a strong, making very tough decisions, but listening and engaging with others to inform those decisions, being compassionate, empathetic, and being able to communicate with everyone around you so that you're a trusted leader and a leader that they will follow and comply with sort of some of the tougher requirements that are being put out there. And in the end, it all being about effectiveness. It's about the results that their leadership delivers. We know that we need these, and I think we've heard we need these talented women leaders during times not only of crisis, but of calm. And we need the best leaders. We need women and men to lead our countries, our ministries, our organizations. But we also need to be ensuring that women have some of the same opportunities as men. And I think that's where we're starting to see those kind of the need for role models and coming forward. What I'd love to do now is turn to our audience questions and be able to pass a few of those on to our speakers. Here's one perhaps for either for you, Helen, or for President Sirleaf. How do you feel the classification of women leaders as empathetic leaders affects the perception of them as strong leaders? And how may or may not this perpetuate gendered ideas of so-called, the strong attributes?
Well, I think leaders have to be decisive, but to be decisive without having listened is not terribly sensible. So I think that if you can have that combination of listening, consulting, being seen to want to draw on the best advice around you, and then you move to decision, that's the key thing. I think the trap is to be unable to reach a decision that makes sense to people. But a process is always important in getting to a decision. So the more engagement, the more communication, the more listening in a quite deliberative process of getting to where you want to be with the decision, I think is important. Any perception that a leader is dithering is fatal, and probably particularly fatal for women, because if the double standard is really kind of expecting and let's face it, in some cases even wanting women to fail, dithering is fatal. So listen, engage, communicate, but make a decision and move forward. Be prepared to fine tune it, as President Ellen has said, if not everything's working quite the way you want to. But again, be communicating and engaging around why you're doing that as well.
I don't see the contradiction between being an empathetic or compassionate leader and a strong leader. I don't see any contradiction there. I think women show empathy when it's necessary, but that's in the midst of being able to take the strong decisions that are required. It means that they may make that decision with a little bit more hesitance, with a little bit more compromises, just to ensure that humanity is preserved. That's weak, that's strength, that's not weakness. And so I really don't see that any contradiction. I think you're strong and empathetic. That's what makes you a woman. That's what makes a difference.
So maybe not buying into the masculine script that strength and empathy are not side by side critical leadership characteristics. It's that authentic leadership voice of women that brings the two together. President Sirleaf, one for you. Since women are at the center of family care, but are still being called upon to work at the front lines of the pandemic, are there any measures that can be taken to support them and some of the special needs, for example, in protecting their families from COVID infection while they're working?
Clearly, in poor countries like my own, many of our health workers are women. Community health workers, 70% are women. I think you said the same thing. They don't have the protective material that they need to be able to provide their service. And so they are at great risk. Most times they are poorly paid, these women health workers, compared to other professions. And so, one needs to really have the means to provide them what they need, to make them, to mitigate the risks they face, to enable them to serve, and to enable them to feel like they are appreciated for what they do, because many times they're not. It's just like they carry out a routine and people just expect them to do so because that's their profession, that's their calling, that's their obligation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to really do more to enable them to work properly. We need to pay them more, and we need to appreciate them more.
This is a huge issue which President Ellen is highlighting, because around 70%, I understand, of the global health workforce is female. And in any health crisis, then those women are on the front line. And I recall the just terrible and tragic death toll among people in the health workforce at the time of Ebola, and people struck down at the prime of their lives, trying to care for and support others. And in this context of the pandemic, yet to have its full force felt in Africa, we still have a chance. We still have a chance to stop the worst happening. The worst has been happening in the United States. It's been happening in continental Europe and the United Kingdom. And again, we're seeing the number of health workers who are being directly impacted by this. Some are dying. Some have been very, very seriously ill. I saw a tragic case reported out of New York of a very talented woman medical leader who has taken her own life with the pressure of what she was dealing with, of such acutely ill patients in these intensive care units. So not even in the most advanced economies in the world is there enough support for the health workforce. Now, we have time to support all of those who are in a position to help get the protective equipment and support to Africa. The window is short, because once pandemics get traction, they go like wildfire. So my plea would be to all who are listening and watching, get onto your country. If it's a country that's a donor country, get onto your organization. Find the best ways of getting equipment and support through to the next front line, which is the Southern Hemisphere developing countries, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. So very practical things need to be done to get the gear out there.
Thank you. Zoe, a question for you. A number of the listeners have remarked that they've heard of the glass ceiling, but this concept of a glass cliff is a bit new and seems to fit very much in some of the conversation that we've had so far. Can you kind of explain what the glass cliff is?
Yes, the glass cliff is one of my favorite concepts. But before I do that, I just wanted to also amplify in the United States and in wealthy countries that have large elderly populations in care homes and nursing homes, there the proportion of women frontline care providers is actually 9 out of 10. And these are also even more poorly paid than our nurse force. And they tend to be 25% immigrants. Most live in or near the poverty line, and they have large families. And so I just wanted to thank the person who asked the question, because there is sexism built into how we reward and acknowledge people who are basically responsible for keeping us all alive if we contract COVID. So the glass cliff is a term used to describe the phenomenon that women and women or people of color in wealthy countries, at least, which is where it's been studied, are more likely to be put into positions of power during a crisis. And so there are ways of seeing this as a sort of rope that's being thrown by a corporation or a large organization to avert crisis by going to the leader of last resort, the woman or person of color who's seen as being kind of uniquely well positioned to weather the storm. That's the gloss on it. The negative side of that is that it also means that women in particular tend to be put into positions of power and authority when they are least likely to succeed because they have the least support and the sort of fewest resources and the most constraints on what their organization's trajectory of success should look like. And so one of the challenges with the glass cliff is to think about how can we harness the kind of unique social resilience and potential of women and people of color and other underrepresented groups who make it up the ranks to be qualified for positions of leadership in spite of the odds, in spite of the stereotypes, in spite of discrimination, without only turning to us or them when there is sort of no one else who's interested in the job. So that's the phenomenon of the glass cliff. In this case, we have women who are, elected heads of state or appointed heads of government who were there before the pandemic emerged. But it is certainly something to keep an eye out for as you think about how to kind of harness this crisis to increase the representativeness of our leadership force and to bring more women. If you bring women in during a crisis, you should give them every ounce of support and resources that you would give to any man in that situation.
So we're coming to close to the end of our session. I want to give one last question that I'll ask all of our speakers to answer, perhaps beginning with you, President Sirleaf. So this is that we have a large group listening to us today. And so speaking to all of the future female heads of state, heads of government, heads of organizations and corporations that are listening in, what is the piece of advice or the one thing you really want them to take away from this conversation?
Determine your leadership goal. Stay focused on the plan of your journey. Do not be deterred by obstacles and the kinds of problems you would face. Go unabashedly toward claiming the leadership that you've earned or you seek to earn, and reach back and form alliances with other women who have excelled at a higher level than you have, and also those who you can then become a guiding example for their encouragement. And until women network with each other, support each other, vote for each other, the kind of force we have as women, the power of women, have not yet been fully tested or tapped. Every now and then it comes up when needed, and it's demonstrable but we need to, again, build toward using it more often to support each other so that each one achieve their leadership goals.
Thank you. Helen?
Building on and accepting everything that President Ellen has said, I think my key message would be believe in yourself and your abilities to do this. If you've been succeeding in other parts of life, you know, whatever your occupation involvement was, there's a reasonable chance that you can succeed in taking the skills you've learned into political leadership and decision making. Now, I think often we as women are our own worst enemies. There's sometimes people suggest that when a position or is opening up, men who are about 60% qualified will say, yes, I can do it. And women who are 120% qualified say, oh, not me, not yet, I'm not ready. We have to get over that. We have to believe in ourselves. We can do this. We can step in. We can take all the experience that we've had and we can apply it to this new challenge. So that would be my strong plea. Don't sit back and say, oh, well, I'm not just ready yet. And then see some man who is clearly not ready take the job. No, step forward and build the alliances around you, which will enable you to be propelled forward, if you like.
Thank you. Zoe?
So I wanted to return to some of the ratios that I mentioned, this idea that 9 out of 10 frontline care workers in our nursing homes and our continuing care facilities in America are female, and 9 out of 10 heads of state globally are male. And what I would like us to do during and after this crisis and in the recovery process as we rebuild is try to get those ratios closer together, to get the remuneration and esteem with which we hold those people closer together. And this is not just because it's nice. It's not just because it's the morally just thing to do, but it's because it would have saved lives, I think, in this pandemic, and it will save lives going forward to pay our frontline workers and our care providers in ways that recognize the service they provide to our communities and our societies, and to also ensure that everyone from all walks of life has access to the highest levels of political power. And so what that means is people who are currently in positions of leadership, make sure that your team looks something like the community you serve. And for those of you who are in service positions, thank you for the work you've been doing and for the strength you've shown. But as Helen said, please do find ways to take that to the top. Even if the top is not yet ready for you, you can be ready to give them the ideas and the truths that you see. And lastly, I just wanted to say, for everyone on the call who's experiencing loss and grief, I hope that this conversation has given you a little bit of strength. But I also just want you to know that you're in my thoughts. This has been an incredibly difficult time. And even thinking about kind of the contours of power and of stereotypes and of social disadvantage can be a lot. So thank you for this opportunity, Amy and WomenLift Health, to convene the conversation, because it does help me kind of live through another day and imagine what our future will look like when we build forward rather than building backward.
Thank you. Thank you all so very, very much for coming and joining us today and for sharing these incredible lived experiences and insights onto the important role that women leaders can play as we all jointly tackle this pandemic, and inspiring, I think, everyone as individuals, as senior leaders, as organizations, to do more to ensure that these very talented, young, mid-career women have an opportunity to be sharing their skills, their voice, and making the world a better place for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.